Aviv. Well, there's much to talk about. Let's get to our panel. Joining us from Tel Aviv is Akiva Bigman. He writes for the daily newspaper Israel Hayom. Here in the studio, Omar Baddar is the Deputy Director of the Arab American Institute right here in Washington, D.C. With us from Jerusalem is the senior commentator for the Jerusalem Post, Amotz Asa-El. And joining us via Skype from Jerusalem is Israeli pollster and political analyst, Mitchell Barak. Thank you to all of you for joining us. Mitchell Barak, let me start with you. If we look at the two big parties in this election, that's Likud, led by Benjamin Netanyahu, and the Blue and White Party, led by Benny Gantz. Statistically, they come out of this election 50-50. They will need the help of smaller parties if either one of these big blocs are to form a government. But who do you think has a better chance of forming the next government?
Well, we don't know who won the election, but it does seem like Prime Minister Netanyahu lost the election because he certainly doesn't have the leeway that he had back in April to form a government. Meaning, if we go back to April, he really had the chance to form a right-of-center government with 61, possibly more, and he could have formed the national unity government with 70 with the blue and white. He's lost a lot of momentum and a lot of seats, almost 5 to 9 seats, depending on how you look at it. He's going to need, both people are going to need more parties. And the real key here is going to be Lieberman, because Lieberman has said that he will recommend only someone who's going to form a national unity government. And Netanyahu is already speaking in his divisive tones. So it's clear that he's not going to do that. And Gantz is talking about possibly forming a national unity government.
Mitchell, you talk about Avigdor Lieberman. He is the former foreign minister, of course. What would he want in return for joining either one of the big parties?
Well, it's impossible to know what Lieberman wants because the man is a political enigma in many ways. He's been, as you said, foreign minister. He recently completed a term as defense minister. So he's hit the two top positions in the country after prime minister. One thing he does want, he probably wants to destroy Netanyahu at some point, having worked with him and maybe have had enough of him, and to, put Israel on a proper path and really go down as this could be his greatest legacy as to helping move Israel past the Netanyahu era. He's already made his claim very clear, meaning that he's going to go form a national unity government, and that he's going to recommend whichever leader has the best chance of doing that.
Amotz Asa-El, let me get your view on this. What do you make of the outcome, and which way do you see the political winds blowing in Israel right now?
Well, first of all, the parliamentary complications are indeed such as Mitch has described them, and it will take weeks until this fog clears. But in terms of the personal aspect of the situation, the voter has made, I think, an emphatic statement. Netanyahu has lost nearly 1/5 of the following with which he entered this election, and I think that this was a massive vote of no confidence in him, reflecting public disenchantment with Netanyahu's personal conduct, not only in terms of the specific allegations that he faces legally, but also in terms of his response, his public response to this legal entanglement, which was to attack the judiciary, the police, and the media. And this has evidently been disagreeable to a critical mass of the public, as has also been his attack on the Arab-Israeli public. It's a very sizable portion of society, and apparently even many of Netanyahu's voters found this part of his recent conduct disagreeable.
Akiva Bigman, what do you make of that criticism of Benjamin Netanyahu, that he's lost 1/5 of his support, and also that this was essentially a vote of no confidence in him?
Yeah, well, I think this interpretation is wrong, because when you check the actual numbers of the voters that turned out and voted for Likud, for Netanyahu's party, you see that basically he got the same numbers. He had 1 million and maybe 100,000 votes in the April elections. This is approximately the same number he's getting today. We don't know the exact results yet, but he's getting there. So I think to interpret this as some kind of statement on Netanyahu's policy, maybe disagreement of the public with things he said, I think there's no evidence for that, because the same people who supported them in the past still support him today. What happened is that there was a bigger turnout this time, specifically in the Arab parties, And this kind of reshuffles the whole field. So 1,100,000 votes that were 35 seats in the last elections now are maybe 32 or 33. So Netanyahu's power is, he lost power, that's obvious. But I don't think you can see this as some kind of public statement on his policies or maybe on his ideas.
All right, Mitchell, you're the pollster. Did Benjamin Netanyahu retain the support in this election that he had in the April election?
That is about the most creative math equation that I've ever heard. Besides the fact that the Prime Minister should take responsibility for delegitimizing the 1.2 million Israeli Arab citizens and making them go out and helping them go out to vote, the Prime Minister last time got 35 seats in the Likud. He then added 4 seats from Moshe Kahlon by combining that party. That would make 39. And then towards the end of the election, he got Moshe Feiglin, who got about 100,000 votes, which is about 2 seats. So I'm showing he was at 41 seats coming into this election. He is in a very negative momentum. He has failed to even replicate close to what he had the last election. So it's great to say that. I don't see those numbers working out.
All right, let me move on. Omar, at this stage, the Joint List, which is a predominantly Arab party in Israel, they will get 13 seats. Firstly, what do you make of Arab turnout in this election?
I do think it's significant, and I think that it's fair to say that it is a reaction to the fact that there has been a lot of anti-Arab rhetoric that Benjamin Netanyahu has been engaging in. But I want to note the fact that this is ultimately consequential in terms of disempowering Netanyahu to some extent, but it does not necessarily reflect a positive turn towards the Palestinian citizens of Israel's future, essentially, and more crucially also in terms of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict more broadly. Because across the entire political spectrum in Israel, this big debate between those two main parties, the Likud and Blue and White, there was consensus on annexation of large parts of the West Bank, consensus on continuing the occupation and continuing to rule Palestinians without giving them a voice in their own future, consensus on keeping Gaza under siege. In fact, if anything, Netanyahu came under criticism for not being tough enough on Gaza, and he had Gantz basically posturing about how the idea of annexing parts of the West Bank was really his idea that was stolen from his party, and how, had he been in power, he was basically flaunting how much tougher he would be on the Palestinians. So effectively, what you have is an endorsement of Israeli apartheid where Palestinians are completely disempowered, and that is an incredibly troubling thing because that was not really a factor in the election.
Yeah.
That the moral crisis that faces Israel as an entire country was not a factor in its own election that we're all talking about.
Omar, are you saying that the Joint List will not be inclined to join either of these big parties?
I think they've made it pretty clear. I mean, Netanyahu obviously would not want anything to do with them given the anti-Arab rhetoric he's engaged in. And the Blue and White Party has also made it very clear, not in this round of the election, but the one that happened earlier this year, that they have no interest in joining the Joint List and forming a coalition.
All right.
So we'll wait and see how this actually ends up playing out, but it's pretty clear that you have a political climate that is so anti-Arab that it is in favor of anybody who wants to gain mainstream acceptance to basically distance themselves from Palestinian citizens of Israel to the greatest extent possible.
All right, Amotz Asa-El, what do you make of that analysis?
First of all, just to be accurate, Gaza is not under Israeli siege for the simple cartographic reason that Israel does not fully surround Gaza. Part of Gaza borders on Egypt. And Israel simply has a closed border with Gaza because Gaza makes it plain that it is Israel's enemy, just like there is a closed border between Israel and Syria. But that's
they also control the sea and they don't let them have an airport, so it's not just their border.
No, once again, we cannot besiege Gaza because part of it borders on Egypt. So Israel does not besiege Gaza. This is simply wrong factually.
Who's in control of the water and the airspace?
This is not what we have assembled to discuss.
No, come on, please,
Gaza
let's
is
be
not
serious
under
about
Israeli
that.
siege.
Israel can block
Period.
its border with Gaza, and Egypt can block its border with Gaza. But Gaza's access to the sea and not being allowed to have an airport, that is the result of Israeli policy.
Okay.
When Palestinian ships
Gaza
go into
can
the
also
water,
have
it is
access
Israelis
to
who
the
are
sea
shooting at
through
them.
Egypt. So no, the discussion will not be productive if we twist the facts. We can discuss opinions based on the facts.
All right, I want to get back to the election, Amotz.
Okay, the fact is that Gaza has a border with Egypt, and it is Egypt that, if you have such a grievance, it is to them that you should lead it, because they are not at war with Gaza. Gaza is at war with Israel.
All right,
and Israel cannot be expected to have an open border with an entity that fights it. But that's besides the point.
Yeah,
we were discussing what the Israeli Arab voter has stated in this election. Now, once again, to be factually accurate, while it is true that the Arab faction in the Knesset is not inclined to join either of these emerging political blocs, the leader of the Arab party that has just won 13 seats, Ayman Uda is his name, he actually did say in an interview 2 weeks ago that he does want to join one of the coalitions. He was only then opposed by all of his colleagues. But if he manages to prevail over his colleagues and indeed enter into a coalition negotiation, obviously with Gantz and not with Netanyahu, I think that that will be a great breakthrough in terms of relations between Israel's Jewish and Arab populations.
Mitchell, what's your view on that?
Well, actually, we did a poll for the Konrad Adenauer program of Jewish-Arab relations in Israel at the Tel Aviv University, and it was quoted in the New York Times that we found that 50% of Israeli Arabs, we polled exclusively Israeli Arabs, 50% would support the joint list joining the government, and another 30% said don't join the government, but let's support from the outside. So it may be that the politicians are continuing with the rhetoric, but the word on the street and the Israeli Arab citizens here are ready to participate more than they have in the past. And I think we saw that with the turnout. I think even something was unprecedented that Benny Gantz spoke by phone to Ayman Odeh last night. Yeah. I don't remember that ever happening, that a leader even spoke to, let alone so quickly, the head of the joint list faction. They could recommend Benny Gantz to be leader. They might not. But I think we are on uncharted territory here. Yeah. I think this is a direct result, and it will be one of it will be one of Netanyahu's greatest achievements in Israeli democracy, that what started 4 years ago with saying the Arabs are coming in droves to vote, and then the nation-state law last year, and then delegitimizing the Arab population, many of them are saying, we are going to be part of this country. Okay. And you're not going to keep us quiet, and you're not going to make a second-class citizen.
I think that analysis is perfectly correct, and I just don't want to confuse two things. Certainly, Palestinian citizens of Israel, through the Arab joint list, want to be part of the political process, want to give themselves political empowerment.
Well, they voted.
And engage, exactly. Yeah. But at the same time, you have a situation where a bill introduced by the Arab joint list, simply declaring Israel a country of all of its citizens, to basically, essentially recognize the equality of Palestinian citizens of Israel, was not only turned down in the Knesset, but was prevented from being even debated. So we just have a very long way to go before we achieve that.
All right. I want to move on to some of the other factors that might have influenced this election. Akiva Bigman, President Netanyahu, Prime Minister Netanyahu has very close ties with President Trump. Did that help him or hurt him in this election?
Well, it's hard to know because his close ties with Trump sometimes maybe some people might view them as negative, and it might cause a lot of pressure on him. It's hard to know. I assume that Netanyahu supporters enjoy these relations and like it, but on the other hand, it might influence other factors, as you spoke about the Arabs and maybe parties on the left, to actually show up and turn out in the polls because they want to contrast this relationship, because Trump is viewed as divisive also in Israel. The people on the right like him very much, but the people on the left not so much. So maybe the Trump-Netanyahu connection was very good for Netanyahu supporters, but was maybe also one of the factors that caused his opposition to rise up. So it's hard to tell.
Okay. Amotz Asa-El, there was one other development concerning President Trump just before the election. He and Prime Minister Netanyahu announced a mutual defense alliance. Let's listen to what the Prime Minister had to say. Let's watch this.
I spoke with my friend President Trump, and we agreed to move forward with a historical defense alliance between the US and Israel during our upcoming meeting at the United Nations General Assembly. This is historical because it adds a huge layer of deterrence for our enemies, together with preserving the freedom of operation of our forces.
So, Amotz, how did Israelis see that before the election? Did they see this as an attempt by the United States to interfere, to meddle in the election?
No, certainly not by the United States, because the initiative is Israeli rather than American. But in terms of its substance, this entire initiative flew here like a gimmick. First of all, technically, because as far as I understand, Congress in America is forbidden legally to strike such a deal with a country whose borders are in dispute, as Israel's indeed are. We've just demonstrated that in this discussion. And besides that, in terms of the need and the impact of such a prospective deal, it is against the Israeli ethos. The Israeli ethos is that the Jewish state will defend itself in a moment of emergency. And moreover, should we have in the future a defense pact with a superpower, in my view, that might put us to sleep and gradually make us spend less on defense and become dependent on that foreign power. And I think, therefore, that it is very, very undesirable.
But you're looking at another issue that might have influenced the election. Prime Minister Netanyahu pledging to annex parts of the occupied West Bank. Omar was talking about that a moment ago. He said that days before the election, and it's a policy that Benny Gantz also supports. Did that influence the election in any way, either way?
Well, I think it's a lot of people were a little bit skeptical, and I think they took it about as seriously as when he got up in Bar-Ilan University and said he supported a two-state solution, a Palestinian state alongside a Jewish state of Israel. He makes these pronouncements. People know that nothing's going to happen. He was the prime minister for 10 years. He didn't do very much to formally annex any area, and I don't think he had any intention to do it moving forward. And in fact, that if there's any kind of national unity government, or if he was thinking about any kind of wide-ranging government, that would not go through.
When we talk about the move to possibly annex parts of the West Bank, we should be clear about the fact that there is already de facto annexation, right? It's not official, it's not declared as annexation, but in reality on the ground, Israel is in control of the Jordan Valley, and Palestinians do not have freedom of movement, do not have any basically right to self-determination inside their own territory. But I really think that this entire conversation has highlighted over and over again the extent to which Israeli politics is divorced from reality. You know, you've heard Mitchell talk about how Israel is already a Jewish and democratic state, ignoring the fact that the nation-state law that passed says explicitly that the right to self-determination is unique to the Jewish people, and that Palestinian and the Palestinian citizens of Israel, their repeated efforts to introduce equality were rebuffed over and over again. And you have a conversation about Gaza, which is recognized by the United Nations as under Israeli siege. Every human rights organization calls on Israel to lift that siege, and we have this silly game we're playing as though Israel is not really in control of the Gaza.
Okay, why don't you talk about the election in the Palestinian Authority? I heard that Abu Mazen is in the 14th year of his 4-year term. It's great that we're talking about a democracy. This ballot right here is the only the only Arabs in the Middle East that can vote in a free election.
Well, Tunisia's just had a vote, so they're not the only Arabs in the Middle East. But
go out and vote. They can't do that in the Palestinian Authority.
So,
they don't do it in
fair
Jordan.
point, right? The
They don't
Palestinian
do it in-
Authority
they
ought to be
do it
more
in
democratic.
I would like to add to this.
Yeah, okay.
I just want to squeeze something in here in response to this.
Akiva, I'll get to you very quickly, Omar.
The Palestinian Authority ought to be more democratic. It is indeed a scandal that we have unelected officials for so long. However, let's be clear about something.
One moment,
Let's be clear about something.
One moment, Mitchell.
Let's be clear about something. There was a Palestinian election in 2005, and it elected Mahmoud Abbas, who is the most pliant Palestinian president who was bending over backwards to accommodate Israeli and American demands. And what was the result? Continued occupation in French settlements. So this is not based on a Palestinian election.
Yeah, I don't want to go off the track here. Akiva, you want to say something? Mitchell, I will get to you. Akiva, go ahead.
Yes, I wanted to add something about the Israeli Arabs. Well, last week, Ayman Ouda, the head of the Arab Joint List, he was very proud on how well the Arab students are doing in Israel. Yeah. And he was saying, he claimed they're doing so well, but although Israel is causing so much trouble for them, but still they're thriving and they're doing so well.
Right,
Akiva,
but
I think it's wrong because the students, the Arab students are doing well because the Israeli Arabs have a good life in Israel.
Okay, I want to look at something else, Akiva. Akiva, we were talking a moment ago about these proposals to annex parts of the West Bank. The Arab League has responded to that. This is what they had to say. Let's listen to this.
The Council considers this announcement as a dangerous progression and a new Israeli aggression, one that violates international law, the UN Declaration, as well as legitimate international decisions such as Security Council Decisions 338 and 242. The Council considers these statements as undermining any chances of progress in the peace process, completely eradicating its foundations.
So, Akiva, my question on that is, are Israeli political parties in this election or any other election playing politics with the occupation and with settlements to score election points here?
Well, I don't think so. Having control of the Jordan Valley is one of the essence of Israel's security. Everybody on all sides agrees on this. The idea basically came from one of the greatest leaders of labor, Yigal Allon, that Israel should annex the Jordan Valley and then maybe have some kind of autonomy for Palestinians in their cities. And I think the announcement we just heard, they misinterpreted the UN policy. Decision 242 does not say Israel has to give up all the territories it captured, only some of it. And the essential needs of Israel for security are recognized by almost everybody else.
Amotz Asa-El, I'll get to you, Omar. I just want to get through something else again, and that is there was a major revelation in Haaretz newspaper before the election saying that the Prime Minister Netanyahu, was almost on the verge of ordering the Israeli Defense Force to go to war in Gaza, something which would have postponed the election. What do you make of that?
Well, I couldn't corroborate the factuality of this report. Obviously, if it's true, it's scandalous. But then again, assuming that all of that report is accurate, then what it actually shows is that Israel is built in such a way that no leader can just on his own volition and single-handedly lead this country to war. There are too many checks and balances along the way between his will and the army's action.
Omar, I want to ask you this realistically. You know, we have what we have. If you look at this election and its outcome, which way do you see what is left of the peace process going?
There is no such thing as a peace process at this point. I mean, what you have is a situation in which Israel is fully empowered.
All right, let me ask you this. If Benny Gantz becomes the next prime minister,
pretty much nothing will change.
No?
It's pretty clear what his policy is, and it's pretty much a continuation of Netanyahu's policies for the most part when it comes to the Palestinians. But I just want to respond to something that was said earlier. It is simply factually incorrect to pretend that there is any legitimacy to the occupation under international law. You, in Resolution 242, explicitly states that it is inadmissible to acquire territory through force. And that is the basis on which it calls on Israel to withdraw from the territories that were occupied. The International Court of Justice has repeated that, and every major human rights organization has repeated that. There is simply no basis. When Amotz says that there's a dispute on Israel's borders, the dispute is between Israel and the rest of the world about whether Israel can hold on to the occupied territory.
All right, I want to get back to the election. Mitchell, one final point. There are 3 pending corruption cases facing Benjamin Netanyahu, and there are reports that he would pursue legislation insulating him from any kind of indictment if he becomes prime minister. I mean, what happens if he loses?
If he loses in the cases or in the election?
No, in the election, if he's not prime minister any longer.
Listen, I mean, I think he should be reading some history books about Richard Nixon. You know, when the United States was in some trouble there, they said, you know what, maybe it's time for President Nixon to leave, and we're going to ease the path out of there. And it just so happens that President Ruby Rivlin is the person that's going to decide who gets the mandate to form the government, and also who pardons criminals, or even potential criminals, or people under indictment. So, you know, he should really be thinking, if he's not going to win, he's got to find a way to gracefully leave that will protect him from possible prosecution and punishment, but also save some of his legacy. Meaning he has done some good things, although he's done some damage along the way. He has led Israel for 10 years, successfully on many fronts, and maybe it's time for him to look at his legacy and see where to go from here, instead of what it looks like he's going to go down fighting very much like Samson and Delilah did. If he can't have what he wants, he's going to tear this building down.
Okay, we're going to have to leave it there. Thanks to all of you for being with us. That's it for this edition of The Heat. I'm Anand Naidu in Washington, D.C. Thanks for watching.